If you haven't noticed, if you haven't been on a channel before, my videos are not full of jump cuts and B-roll and graphics every 3 to 5 seconds. And the topic that I'm talking about today is gonna require you to sit down and really absorb information for a period of time. So if that doesn't sound like you, if you're not someone that can sit down and really be intentional with your time and focus for a number of minutes, then TikTok might be where you should go. This isn't gonna be the best channel for you, and I'm okay with that. But if you're someone that can actually sit with an idea and absorb it long enough to really use it and implement it, well, then you are in the right place. What I'm about to share with you today is going to completely change the way that you think about one of the most misunderstood concepts in performance today. Sit down, relax, let's get into it. Nobody burns out from doing work that they truly love. I know that sounds simple, but I've spent years of my life completely drained, running 5 different income streams all at the same time, part of which required doing hard physical labor. And at points I was just convinced that I wasn't working hard enough or I wasn't disciplined enough to keep going. And then something in my life finally shifted. And it wasn't the hours that I was working, it wasn't the output that I was generating with those hours. What shifted was the alignment between what I was doing and who I actually was. And my life looks way different now, but I still work pretty hard. I still have long days, but what I experience at the end of those days is just tiredness, not that other thing that everyone's claiming to experience. And it's not the kind of tiredness where you wake up feeling already depleted before the day even begins. And the difference between being tired and being depleted is not just a matter of how much you're doing. The difference of those two states is what you're doing and why. And the distinction between those experiences, between why some people are able to sustain high level of efforts despite being tired versus others who succumb to a specific title and withdraw from those efforts. That distinction is the entire conversation today. I am Jesse Hoffman, performance coach and founder of the Clarity Code. I work with founders and operators across 4 different continents, from early stage entrepreneurs to business owners doing 6, 7, 8+ figures. And many of them feel like they've hit a ceiling that just business strategy and SOPs and all these other things that live above the surface cannot solve. Where I work with them is on the internal layers, how they think, how they decide, the patterns through which they operate under pressure. And burnout, or what everyone's calling burnout, shows up in 90+% of all the conversations that I have before we fix anything else. Before we get into this, if you're in a position similar to what I just described and you're wondering why your output isn't where you want it to be, well, I have a diagnostic linked right below this video that you can fill out to measure your output, measure your performance across 5 dimensions, and get some feedback on the other end of it. So click that link below. Otherwise, let's dive in. What I want to walk through today comes down to 3 primary things. The first is why the label itself, burnout, is the problem, and what the research around burnout actually says about what it is and what it's not, because most people have it completely wrong. The second is the real variable, which is not how much you're doing on an overall level of output, but specifically the structural relationship between what you're doing and who you are, specifically who you tell yourself you are. The third is why the conventional solutions that people use to manage burnout tend to fail them, and how you can actually get down and address the root cause. By the end of this video, you're gonna have a way different framework and outlook for understanding what you've been calling burnout, and you'll have a much clearer picture for what's actually happening in the way that you're performing. This is a good reminder to make sure to hit that subscribe button, like this video. I'm going into this topic way deeper than what you're about to hear today, so make sure you're subscribed. The very first thing that's absolutely crucial to establish when it comes to the idea of burnout is that in no way, shape, or form is it a scientifically established term. Burnout has become one of those words, like depression and many others, but I won't go down that rabbit hole. It's become one of those words that's just so freely used in the modern performance conversation, in the workplace, in this hustle and grind culture. Exhausted after a hard week of work? Burnout. Unmotivated on a project? Burnout. You don't like your coworkers and they're really starting to get on your nerves and you just need a break? Burnout. That word has expanded to cover almost every single form of fatigue that there is, which means it has stopped being useful as an actual diagnostic term. Because especially in the world that I come from, in psychology and science to begin with, when a label or diagnosis fits everything, it explains nothing. And so if you're not willing to agree with me on the fact that burnout is not a real diagnosis, then maybe you can agree with the World Health Organization, who in 2019 explicitly stated that burnout is not a medical condition. It is simply an occupational phenomenon. All that simply means is that it was observed that people in the workplace were experiencing some sort of fatigue. That's it. But the interesting thing is that despite it being a clear observable phenomenon, despite knowing that people are burnt out, people don't like their jobs, according to a study that was done just a year prior, before the WHO put out this classification of a phenomenon, 182 physicians across a systemic study found that the prevalence of burnout ranged from 0% to 80.5%. That alone, the fact that something can be simultaneously 0% and 80.5% should be enough to tell you that burnout is not a well-defined term. And so it's certainly not something that should be used to the degree that we're seeing it used nowadays. But here's the thing, it's undeniable that people are experiencing some type of tiredness, fatigue, frustration, overwhelm. The problem is that the label, the fact that it's such a catch-all for anything that someone's experiencing tends to lead people towards the wrong explanation as to why they're experiencing that. And unfortunately, a diagnosis that fits everyone and fits everything fits no one or anything. So before you can actually fix what's happening, prevent the burnout, you have to name it accurately. One thing that I've observed across my clients, across studies that I've gone down the rabbit hole of, is that burnout, if we're going to call it burnout for the sake of talking about it, has absolutely nothing to do with the volume of work that is performed. Where it actually surfaces is as a result of the structural relationship of a person with their work. Unfortunately, the dominant assumption across the board is that burnout is some sort of math problem and that too many hours plus too little rest equals burnout. If that were the case, then most people who are taking time off on the weekends or going on vacations just to return back to the same environment and find themselves back in the same state within weeks couldn't possibly claim to be experiencing burnout because they've taken time off, right? Well, no, of course that's wrong because nothing is structurally changed in the way that they're doing their work. That's like getting hit by a truck and having 6 broken ribs and taking painkillers. Well, guess what? Your ribs are still broken. Those painkillers will ease the pain in the moment. That rest will ease or disguise your burnout in the moment, but the problem will persist. So now why don't I lighten the spirits a little bit and get into the good stuff, get into how we can actually shift this narrative and start to understand burnout for what it really is so we can shift the way that we operate and the meaning of our relationship between ourselves and our work. One study that I want to highlight in understanding this is a Mayo Clinic study that found that physicians that spent at least 20% of their time on meaningful work had a 29.9% burnout rate. But now take those same physicians and reduce their time spent on meaningful work below 20%, their burnout rate shoots up to 53.8%. And so what does that tell us? Well, it tells us that meaningful work that felt aligned and purposeful, outweighed total hours as the strongest predictor of burnout. One person can be working 60 hours a week and be completely energized through it all, while there might be someone else here working 35 hours a week and be completely psychologically, mentally collapsed. And so that Mayo Clinic study confirms that the variable that leads to a perceived burnout is the structural relationship between what you're doing and what actually matters to you. And here's exactly how I know this and can confirm it with my own experience. I already mentioned just a few years ago, I was running 5 different income streams simultaneously. I had a part-time retail sales role that I had taken out of college while I was working in my family's surplus and manufacturing business for no pay, while also building a real estate portfolio and managing properties, hard labor, renovations. We even had a flood that came through at one point where I was shoveling sewage off the basement floors of some rental properties, literally shoveling shit, while really growing what mattered to me, my basketball training business, working with clients, and building my online coaching. And at the time, when I was inside of all of that, I thought that the busyness was the proof, and that as long as I was doing enough things and staying in motion, telling myself that I was moving forward in my life, getting somewhere, that was enough. But I felt exhausted in ways that sleep really never fixed. No amount of rest would ever fix all the things going on in my mind that I knew I had to get back to and do the following week, just to go in and wake up feeling already behind, avoiding things that really actually mattered to me, that I felt called to do. The reason I was so drained had nothing to do with the physical labor, the amount of hours I was putting in. It had everything to do with the misalignment that I felt pulling at me each and every day while I was running at full speed. What I had to do was get brutally honest with myself about what I was actually building, what my intentions were, and whether any of the things that I was doing were genuinely mine or just responsibilities that were pressed upon me by circumstance or out of a commitment and loyalty to my family. And as that disconnect between what I was doing and what really mattered to me became louder and louder, I started to build around what fulfilled me, what I knew I was put on this earth to do, and carving out more time for those things. I was still working hard as hell, and some days were even way longer. I would wake up earlier so that I could go in and do my property work and renovate our properties, go around, do any checks, get into my family's office, and be able to help around there for a few hours before bouncing over to my basketball training clients, sometimes going back to the properties in the evenings and then coming back to do calls on days where I didn't have to go to my retail shift. I was working 14, 18-hour days some days. But at that point, all that I experienced was physical tiredness and fatigue that sleep is able to solve. It's not that other thing. And so let me take a moment to go a little bit deeper on what physical fatigue means versus some other things that cause burnout that the wellness industry does not want you to understand, because the wellness industry has built a multi-trillion-dollar economy around the idea that burnout can be solved by rest and boundaries and self-care and certain products. None of that is exactly wrong. There's a lot of great stuff out there that can help you recover in certain ways, but it's all aimed at the symptom, the outcome, rather than the source of the burnout. And so I said before, you can come back from the vacation, you can put on your eye masks, you can do this, that, and the other thing. But if you return to the same misaligned environment, doing the same misaligned work, within weeks, that deficit, that fatigue will begin to build up again. But I'm here to reinforce that it does not have to be this way. There is a plethora of research on what we call harmonious passion and the idea that people that are truly aligned with their work, even just 20% of the time or more, are able to maintain their well-being and sustain their performance far longer, even under extreme demands. This is ultimately what it comes down to if you want to never experience burnout again. You first have to identify the intentional roles that you are playing in your life right now. Next, how can you establish clear operational values? Not just broad generic values, but values that you can operate through. And then finally, taking your roles, taking your values, how do you actually set goals rooted in that identity? But when you take those layers and you put them in order, the conditions that produce what people call burnout cannot sustain themselves. The solution to burnout isn't just a better recovery protocol that you find on TikTok. It's stripping things down and establishing a more honest operating system. And so if you've made it this far and you're ready to work on this directly through improving the alignment between your identity and your actions, there's a link right below. You can click it, fill out some information, and apply to schedule a session with me. If you'd rather start with the diagnostic I mentioned, you can do that as well. But I want to leave you with one final action tonight. I want you to write down the one thing that you're currently doing that seems to drain you the most. And then ask yourself honestly, is it draining you because it's a hard task or because it doesn't align with who you actually are? And that distinction That distinction is a great starting point. And I want you to drop that task or action in the comments below because I want to see what it is, and I want you to see that there might be a lot of other people that relate to it as well. So with that being said, click those links below. I'll see you in the next one. Peace.